What bride could possibly fill such perfect emptiness? Every night, Marcus arranged the dress with religious precision, smoothing each fold, adjusting the veil just so. He'd inherited it from his grandmother's attic, though no one remembered which bride it had belonged to. The fabric held secrets in its threads, stories of women who had worn it to altars both sacred and cursed. The dress began to visit him in dreams. At first, she was Sarah from college, brilliant, unattainable Sarah, who'd chosen medical school over his fumbling declarations of love. Then she became Elena, the co-worker who laughed at his jokes but married someone else. Each night, the phantom bride wore a different face, but always the same dress. Always the same devastating smile that promised everything while delivering nothing. In the dream world she had constructed, Marcus was always the groom she'd been waiting for. She whispered that she was his missing piece, his completion, his destiny made manifest in silk and moonlight. The wedding ceremony played out in an endless cathedral where the guests were all the women he'd loved and lost, their faces blurred by candlelight and longing. As Schopenhauer understood, the will to live creates these beautiful illusions to keep us chasing, suffering, never satisfied with what we actually possess. But when Marcus tried to lift her veil for the kiss, her face dissolved like morning mist. Behind the lace was not a woman, but a mirror reflecting his own desperate features, hollow-cheeked, hungry-eyed, a man in love with his own projection of perfection. The dress crumpled to the cathedral floor, empty once again. He woke to find himself kneeling before his closet at 3 a.m., the dress swaying slightly as if disturbed by invisible hands. His knees ached against the hardwood. How long had he been there, whispering apologies to fabric and thread? The ancients called it divine madness. Today, psychology names it the anima, the unconscious feminine principle that lives in every man's psyche. Carl Jung discovered that men don't fall in love with women. They fall in love with their own inner feminine projected onto women's faces and forms. The anima manifests in modern life through impossible standards we place on partners, the way we chase women who embody our own unlived emotional depths, how we become addicted to the fantasy of completion through another person rather than facing our own inner work. Schopenhauer would call this a particularly cruel trick of the will, making us believe that union with another could end our fundamental loneliness, when in truth, we're simply chasing our own shadow cast in feminine form. The anima is the will's way of ensuring we never stop wanting, never stop suffering, never realize that what we seek outside was always within us. In myth, she was the siren song. In you, she's the woman who exists only in your imagination. The anima. Marcus stared at the empty dress, finally understanding. The phantom bride wasn't coming to save him from himself. She was the part of himself he'd been too afraid to meet, dressed up in wedding white and other people's faces. What phantom are you kneeling before? What empty dress have you spent years trying to fill with someone else's flesh and blood? The most dangerous bride is the one who lives only in your dreams. She asks for everything and gives you back only the echo of your own voice. She collects faces like postage stamps, each one perfectly preserved behind glass, each one a person she used to be. Which mask was the real her? And does it matter anymore? Victoria's apartment looked like a museum exhibit titled The Evolution of Identity. Shelves lined every wall, each displaying a different mask she'd worn throughout her life. The good daughter sat next to the rebel, who faced off against the corporate climber. Each mask was crafted from the expectations of others, molded by their needs, their desires, their projections of who she should become. At 17, she'd been the artist, flowing scarves and paint-stained fingers, everything her conservative parents despised. By 25, she'd morphed into the success story, sharp suits and sharper ambition, everything they'd secretly hoped for. Each transformation felt like salvation at the time, a way to finally be loved, finally be enough. But the masks grew heavier with each passing year. The good wife mask cracked when her marriage dissolved. The perfect mother mask shattered completely when her teenage daughter screamed, "I don't even know who you are anymore." Victoria found herself standing in the wreckage of performed identities, surrounded by broken pieces that had never quite fit together. In her dreams, she wandered through galleries of herself, hundreds of Victorias staring back from gilded frames. Each painting moved and spoke, offering competing narratives of who she was meant to be. As Schopenhauer observed, we become prisoners of our own will to be perceived, constantly shape-shifting to match others' expectations while losing ourselves in the performance. She discovered a door at the museum's heart, unmarked, unremarkable, easily missed. Behind it sat a single mirror in an empty room. The reflection showed nothing at first, just an outline where a person should be. Then, slowly, features emerged, not beautiful or ugly, not successful or failing, just present. The face looking back was one she barely recognized, herself, without audience, without applause, without the crushing weight of others' needs. The most terrifying revelation wasn't that the masks were false, it was that she might not exist without them. The ancients called it the shape-shifting spirit. Today, psychology names it the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social interactions. Carl Jung understood that the persona begins as protection, but becomes a prison, a false self that we mistake for our true identity. This manifests in modern life through our curated social media selves, the exhausting performance of professionalism at work, the way we become addicted to others' approval while losing touch with our authentic desires and values. Schopenhauer would call this the will's most insidious trap, convincing us that we are what others see, that existence requires constant performance and validation. The persona becomes a substitute for genuine being, keeping us forever focused on external reflection rather than internal truth. In myth, it was the trickster's gift. In you, it's the face you can't take off, the persona. Victoria stood before her collection, feeling the weight of a lifetime's performance. Each mask represented a choice to hide rather than be seen, to please rather than exist. What would happen if she stopped collecting faces and started living from the one behind the mirror? Which of your masks has become so comfortable you've forgotten it's not your real face? How long has it been since you've looked in the mirror without performing for your own reflection? The most tragic museum is the one where you're both the curator and the only exhibit, forever arranging displays of who you used to pretend to be. He built his tower so high that no ship could reach the shore, then wondered why he was always alone. How do you signal for rescue from a fortress of your own making? Thomas had been keeping the lighthouse for 37 years, though no ships had passed in the last 15. The beams still swept across empty waters every night, a habit grown into obsession, a duty transformed into delusion. He told himself he was protecting the coast, serving humanity, standing guard against invisible dangers that justified his isolation. The lighthouse had become his temple of superiority. From its heights, he could see the village below, small, ignorant people living small, ignorant lives. Their concerns seemed petty from his elevated perch. Mortgages and marriages, birthday parties and broken hearts. He was above such trivial pursuits, dedicated to higher purposes that others simply couldn't understand. But the tower was also his prison. Each night, as the beam cut through darkness, Thomas wrote letters to the ships that never came. He filled notebooks with profound observations about the human condition, philosophical treatises on solitude and wisdom, elaborate justifications for why connection was impossible for someone of his depth and insight. The letters piled higher than firewood, unread monuments to his own magnificent isolation. In his dreams, the lighthouse stretched infinitely upward, its beam reaching not across water, but through time itself. He could see every moment of his choosing solitude over connection. The parties declined, the invitations ignored, the vulnerable moments when others had reached out only to find his light too bright, his tower too tall to climb. As Schopenhauer knew, the intellect often becomes the will's most sophisticated defense mechanism, creating elaborate philosophies to justify what is simply fear dressed as wisdom. One storm-lashed night, Thomas discovered that the lighthouse beam had been pointing inward all along, illuminating not the sea, but the mirrors lining his tower's walls. For decades, he'd been signaling to his own reflection, mistaking echo for conversation, solitude for enlightenment. The notebooks full of wisdom were just elaborate conversations with himself, brilliant justifications for a life unlived. When he finally descended the spiral stairs, the villagers barely looked up. His absence hadn't been noticed. His presence hadn't been missed. The ships he thought he was guiding had been taking different routes for years. The ancients called it the hermit's madness. Today, psychology names it intellectual grandiosity, a defense mechanism where we use our intelligence to justify emotional withdrawal. This manifests in modern life through academic superiority complexes, the way some people use philosophy or spirituality to avoid genuine intimacy, how we create elaborate theories about why we're too evolved for ordinary human connection while secretly yearning for the very bonds we dismiss. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the intellect serving the will's deepest fear, that we might be ordinary, that we might need others, that our specialness might be just another story we tell ourselves to avoid the vulnerability of genuine relationship. The lighthouse becomes a monument to the ego's final retreat from the messy, imperfect reality of human love. In myth, it was the ivory tower. In you, it's the belief that understanding makes you untouchable. Intellectual grandiosity. Thomas stood at the base of his lighthouse, finally seeing it for what it was. Not a beacon of wisdom, but a monument to fear. Every profound insight had been a brick in the wall between himself and the world. What lighthouse have you built to keep the world at a safe distance? How many years have you spent signaling to ships that sail different waters, writing letters to visitors who were never coming? The loneliest position is the one where you can see everyone, but no one can reach you, even when the isolation is philosophical, especially when it's justified by wisdom. In his warehouse of unopened doors, David cataloged every path he'd never taken, every dream he'd filed away for someday. The most organized man in the world had never learned to live. David's warehouse stretched beyond sight, filled with filing cabinets that reached toward a ceiling lost in shadows. Each drawer contained a different version of the life he might have lived, the musician he'd almost become before choosing accounting, the marriage proposal he'd rehearsed but never delivered, the novel he'd outlined but never written. The cabinets were labeled with meticulous precision, artistic pursuits deferred, romantic possibilities postponed, adventure pending optimal conditions. He spent his days maintaining this archive of almost, ensuring every abandoned dream was properly documented and stored. The wedding dress from the first fable hung in a corner, tagged as romantic idealization, cross-reference, Anima complex. Victoria's discarded masks were arranged in a climate-controlled display case marked Identity Experiments, status incomplete. Each artifact represented someone else's journey toward authenticity, journeys he'd observed but never risked himself. The warehouse had its own weather system, storms of regret, seasons of melancholy, brief sunny periods when he almost convinced himself that someday he'd actually open one of the doors marked emergency use only. But emergency never came, or rather, every day felt both too urgent and too mundane to justify breaking the seal on a carefully preserved dream. In his recurring nightmare, David discovered that the warehouse was actually inside his chest, expanding with each breath of postponed possibility. The weight of unopened doors was crushing his heart, filing cabinets stacked upon his lungs. As Schopenhauer understood, the mind's capacity for endless deliberation can become its own form of suffering, paralysis disguised as wisdom, preparation that never leads to action. One midnight, while updating his catalog of conversations never had, David noticed that many of the doors had begun to fade. The dreams stored behind them were deteriorating from lack of exposure to reality. The musician's hands he'd almost developed were now arthritic from disuse. The words he'd almost spoken to Sarah had yellowed like old newspapers, their urgency lost to time. He found a mirror at the warehouse's center, cracked like the ones in Victoria's collection, reflecting not who he was, but who he'd almost become. The reflection showed every version of himself simultaneously: the artist and the adventurer, the lover and the leader, all of them transparent as ghosts, all of them watching him with eyes full of accusation and fading hope. The ancients called it the curse of perfect vision. Today, psychology names it analysis paralysis, the compulsive need to consider every possibility until action becomes impossible. This manifests in modern life through endless research before any decision, the paralysis of infinite choice in dating apps and career paths, the way we use planning and preparation as sophisticated forms of procrastination that feel productive while keeping us safely suspended between desire and action. Schopenhauer would see this as the intellect's rebellion against the will, using consciousness itself as a prison, creating so much awareness of possibility that we become paralyzed by our own perceptive abilities. The warehouse becomes a monument to the mind's ability to substitute thinking about life for actually living it. In myth, it was the prophet who saw all futures but changed none. In you, it's the voice that says not yet, until yet never comes. Analysis paralysis. David stood among his cataloged dreams, finally understanding that the most dangerous archive is the one inside your own chest. Every filed away possibility was a small death, every postponed decision a vote against your own existence. What dreams have you been storing in perfect condition instead of risking an imperfect reality? How many doors in your warehouse have you been saving for a someday that gets more distant each time you check the calendar? The most organized life is often the most unlived. Filing systems don't make dreams come true. They just make them easier to avoid. She mapped every storm in her soul, but never learned to dance in the rain. What good is knowing the landscape of your own destruction if you never learn to rebuild? Elena's study was wallpapered with charts of her own psychological terrain. Mood graphs traced the peaks and valleys of her emotional seasons. Trigger maps identified every stimulus that could send her spiraling. Behavioral patterns were color-coded and cross-referenced, creating a beautiful, comprehensive guide to her own internal chaos. She knew herself with scientific precision, and it was killing her softly. The maps grew more detailed each year. Red zones marked areas of chronic depression. Yellow indicated anxiety clusters. Purple showed where her trauma lived, carefully cordoned off and labeled with clinical precision. She could predict her own storms days in advance, watch herself spiral into familiar patterns with the detached fascination of a meteorologist observing a hurricane. But knowing the weather and living through it were different skills entirely. Elena had become so fluent in her own pathology that she'd forgotten other languages existed. Joy, spontaneity, the messy imperfection of simply being human without constant analysis. Her friends stopped calling when every conversation became a dissertation on her latest insight into her own dysfunction. Self-awareness had become its own addiction, understanding a substitute for healing. In her dreams, she wandered through a vast library where every book was about her. Thousands of volumes chronicled her every fault, fear, and failing. The shelves stretched infinitely upward, filled with detailed analyses of why she couldn't maintain relationships, extensive theories about her father issues, comprehensive guides to her self-sabotage patterns. As Schopenhauer observed, consciousness can become its own form of suffering when we mistake endless self-examination for actual transformation. At the library's heart sat a simple mirror, not cracked like Victoria's, not reflecting possibilities like David's, but clean and present. The woman looking back wasn't explained or categorized. She simply existed, imperfect and immediate, tired of being her own research project. Elena realized that her maps had become more real to her than the territory they described. She knew exactly why she pushed people away, but had stopped trying to let them close. She understood her patterns perfectly, but had never broken a single one. The study of herself had become a way to avoid the terrifying work of actually changing. Outside her study, autumn was ending. Real weather moved across real skies, indifferent to her charts and theories. The trees didn't analyze themselves before letting their leaves fall. They simply trusted the season, trusted the process, trusted that bare branches were not the end of the story, but preparation for something new. The ancients called it the curse of the oracle. Today, psychology names it metacognitive entrapment, when self-awareness becomes a prison rather than a tool for liberation. This manifests in modern life through therapy addiction that never leads to change, endless self-help consumption that substitutes knowledge for action, the way some people become so sophisticated in describing their problems that they forget they're supposed to solve them. Schopenhauer would recognize this as consciousness turning against itself, using the very tools meant for liberation as chains of endless reflection. The maps become more important than the journey, understanding more seductive than transformation, because knowledge feels safer than the vulnerability required for actual change. In myth, it was Narcissus staring at his own reflection. In you, it's the belief that understanding yourself perfectly will save you from having to actually live. Metacognitive entrapment. Elena looked at her elaborate maps one final time, seeing them for what they were: beautiful prisons, detailed excuses, sophisticated ways to avoid the simple terror of existing without explanation. She had become an expert on her own storms, but had forgotten how to step outside and feel the rain on her face. What elaborate maps have you drawn of your own dysfunction? How long have you been studying the very patterns you could be breaking right now? The most dangerous knowledge is the kind that makes you feel wise while keeping you exactly where you are, understanding everything and changing nothing.